Good afternoon, everyone. This is the December 7th, 2021 meeting of the City Finance Committee meeting. And may I get a roll call, please?
Yes, Chair Friedman. We'll start with Committee Member Harmon.
Here.
Committee Member Gutierrez.
Here.
And Committee Chair Friedman.
Here. We are all present, so on to public comment. Is there any member of the public who wishes to speak to any item not on today's agenda, but under the purview of the Finance Committee? Mr. DiMartini, do you see anyone with their hands raised?
Chair Friedman, I am monitoring public comment. There are attendees, but no one has their hand raised at this time.
I will close public comments. And we will move on to item 1, which is approval of $75,000 grant toward the Housing Authority for the City of Santa Barbara to provide partial loan pay down of existing housing and community development loan and authorize the restatement of existing city loan and approve a 99-year covenant. So I see Ms. Doubles, you are all set. So you have the floor in the presentation.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Chair Friedman and Council Members Gutierrez and Harmon. I am Laura Doubles, and I'm the Housing and Human Services Manager for the city. Thank you for having us here today to propose a solution to a dire situation of a state foreclosure on one of our community mobile home parks known as Green Mobile Home Park. The park currently provides affordable housing for 41 low-income households. In order to avoid the foreclosure, the city is partnering with the city's housing authority and has stepped up to developed an action plan that was submitted and approved by the State Housing and Community Development, otherwise known as HCD, to transfer the property to the housing authority through their nonprofit affiliate, Second Story Associates, to save the possible loss of the affordable housing. The Housing Authority has graciously been willing to take over the ownership and management of the park in order to help keep the affordable housing in place. Housing Authority staff is also here with me today to answer any questions regarding this proposal as well. Next slide, please. State HCD has a loan on the property in the amount of approximately I ended up getting this. Okay, sorry about that. In this slide, we're showing the staff's recommendation, and it's laid out on the next 3 slides and includes the following. A, recommend that City Council approve $75,000 in grant funding to the Housing Authority of the City of Santa Barbara, known as HACSB, to provide for partial paydown and restructure of the State of California Housing and Community Development, HCD, loan in foreclosure secured by property located at 1200 Punta Gorda Street, Santa Barbara, California, known as Green Mobile Home Park. Next slide, please. B, recommend that City Council introduce and subsequently adopt by reading of title only an ordinance of the Council of the City of Santa Barbara approving a restated 30-year loan agreement secured by a restated deed of trust in the amount of $25,000 and a new 90-year affordability covenant with Second Story Associates for property commonly known as Green Mobile Home Park located at 1200 Punta Gorda Street. Next slide, please. C, recommend that City Council approve an increase in fiscal year 2022 expenditure appropriations in the general fund in the amount of $75,000 funded by General Fund Inclusionary Housing Reserve Funds to fund the requested grant. And D, recommend that City Council authorize the Community Development Director to execute, subject to approval as to form by the City Attorney, such agreements and related documents as necessary. Next slide, please. State HCD has a loan on the property in the amount of approximately $1.4 million that is in serious default and has initiated foreclosure proceedings with an auction to take place on the open market. If the foreclosure is to commence, it could result in a private property ownership private party ownership, which could lead to the loss of low-income affordable housing for 41 households in the park. In order to prevent this foreclosure, the city has partnered with the City Housing Authority to develop an action plan that the state HCD has approved, which will transfer the property to the Housing Authority by way of the Housing Authority's nonprofit affiliate known as Second Story Associates. Next slide, please. The ownership structure has been held by a nonprofit corporation known as Cypress Tree Apartments Incorporated, through which residents have an ownership interest in the park. In 1990, Santa Barbara Community Housing Corporation, known as CHC, issued a bond in order to generate funds for the park and assumed the management of the Cypress Tree Board. Next slide, please. In 1990, State HC also loaned Cypress Tree $650,000 in principal, which with accrued interest, the balance is now approximately $1.4 million. At the same time, the city's redevelopment agency also loaned Cypress Tree $25,000, which with accrued interest, the balance is now at approximately $75,000. With the approved action plan, State HCD has agreed to restructure their debt if a new board is formed and the property is transferred to the Housing Authority. The city is proposing to do the same on the city's loan that is also seriously in default. Next slide, please. With the help of a collaboration that really wants to see the property remain affordable, the city's Housing Authority and the city, along with Senator Limon's office and CHC, have all helped in the process to develop an action plan that the state HCD would accept in order to avoid the foreclosure. This plan consists of forming a new board with the resident owners, which the election was held at Green Mobile Home Park's meeting on November 9th, 2021, and 4 residents were elected to the board along with 3 Housing Authority staff members. So it was successful. The new board then voted on November 17th to authorize a vote of the residents to transfer the park ownership to Second Story Associates. The vote of the residents was approved, I'm happy to say, with 27 yeses and 2 nos. So it was very well received by the residents. State HCD also postponed their scheduled foreclosure sale until December 15th now to allow further progress of the approved action plan. Next slide, please. The action plan consists of the following. Both the Housing Authority and the city have offered to each contribute $75,000 for a total of $150,000 to show good faith in following through with the action plan that the state HCD has approved. State HCD and the city has promised to work with Second Story Associates to restructure both the state and the city terms on their loans in order to make the transfer feasible. State HCD and the city will then transfer both loans to Second Story Associates with the transfer of fee title for ownership. The Housing Authority will then be responsible for managing the property. Next slide, please. The $75,000 city grant staff is proposing today is to provide a good faith payment to HCD for their loan paydown. Most importantly, this is to show that the city is serious and will follow through on the action plan. This $75,000 will be combined with the Housing Authority's already approved by their board $75,000 for a total of $150,000. Staff is proposing this funding to come from the city's Affordable Housing Inclusionary Fund as a grant, which for this purpose is an eligible use of the fund. This contribution by the city will enable 41 low-income households to remain in their affordable mobile homes and will also prevent the loss of valuable affordable housing for our community. Next slide, please. For the city loan restatement, no additional funding is needed. And with restating the loan terms, it will actually clear the current default state. Staff proposes restating the original $25,000 in principal that was provided by the redevelopment agency with new standard affordable housing terms of 30 years, a residual receipt payments at 3% interest, simple interest, and holding all of the current accrued interest separately so as to not compound the interest growth. Next slide, please. As a condition for the funding, there will be a new city 90-year long-term affordability covenant placed on the property. There is no current city covenant on the property as it fell under the state's regulatory purview as a mobile home park with their loan. But now with the transfer to the Housing Authority, we will ensure the affordability remains with the new city 90-year covenant. Next slide, please. In summary, this proposal before you today will prevent the HCD foreclosure and the possible loss of affordable housing for 41 low-income households in Green Mobile Home Park. In order to do so, the city needs to provide a $75,000 grant in combination with the Housing Authority's $75,000 for $150,000 as a good faith for the action plan. We will transfer the fee title to Housing Authority through their nonprofit affiliate Second Story Associates. And we're going to restate the $1.4 million HCD loan, which the state HCD will restate that. And then the city will restate their loan of the original RDA, $25,000 principal. And both loans will transfer to Second Story Associates to cure the loan defaults on both. And then we will record a new city 90-year affordability covenant on the property. Next slide, please. And here we're back to the staff's recommendation, and I am here and available for any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Doubles. I appreciate the presentation. So at this point, I will open it up to questions from my colleagues, Councilmember Harmon or Councilmember Gutierrez. Do you have any questions? And not seeing any.
Chair Friedman, I'm so sorry. I'm not sure why my camera is not working. I apologize.
Go ahead, you have the floor, Councilmember Harmon.
Thank you. Sorry, Ms. Doubles, I think you covered this, but I was hoping for just a little bit more information about how we found ourselves at Green Mobile Home Park in this situation to begin with. And I know we've had a number of issues over the last year related to whether it's mismanagement or just a challenge with the loan terms or whatever the case may be. And I'm wondering if you see any efficacy in us, perhaps at the Finance Committee or the city on some level, pursuing maybe the development of some type of program so that we don't find ourselves in this situation 30 years from now. It seems to me that a lot of where we've ended up are from decisions that happened before any of us were here. And I want to make sure that we move forward with new developments in a way that prioritizes best management practices so that 30 years from now, we don't find ourselves here again. So if you just have a reaction or response to that sort of vague thought, I'd appreciate it.
Absolutely. Chair Friedman and Councilmember Harmon, thank you for that. And yes, I have to say that all of this was very much, prior to me, but each case is a little different. So it is kind of hard to structure something that is, a cookie cutter for each issue, We also don't typically, we have only 2 mobile home parks that we have lent to in the past. So we don't typically do a lot in the way of mobile home park lending or in default, curing defaults. So like I said, it is kind of a different scenario than what we normally do. And in this case, it was just a definite, I think, of mismanagement, possibly, but we are trying to cure that by actually having the residents now on the board, and also with a good entity as the housing authority is to take over when they have that experience of definitely property management and knowing what it takes to make sure that it's sustainable there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Harmon. Not seeing any other questions at this time, I'll open it up to public comment, and any member of the public who wishes to speak to this item, please raise your hand in the app. I don't see anyone. I do see one hand now. I thought I saw one. Mr. DeMartini, do you see anybody?
Chair Friedman, I am monitoring public comment. There was an individual that did raise their hand and then it went away. So if a member of the public would like to speak, please raise your hand.
I saw Pat Wheatley's hand go up, so
It's now up.
Pat, Ms. Wheatley, you have the floor. If you can unmute yourself. I think you're still muted, Ms. Wheatley. Is there a way we can unmute her? Oh, I think you might have it now.
Okay, I'm
There you
sorry.
go.
It's not as clear as it is on the city council board. I apologize. My name is Pat Wheatley. I'm a commissioner for the Santa Barbara City Housing Authority. I'm indeed pleased to be speaking on behalf of the commissioners. We are very strongly in support of this plan. First of all, I want to be very respectful for the amount of work that both the city staff and the City Housing Authority and others have put together this excellent plan for an unfortunate situation that we hope will have a wonderful ending. To protect 41 low-income homes is very, very important for us in this community. Building new ones is a challenge in itself, but to see the potential loss of existing housing is something that we as a community can't ignore. I hope that the committee will look favorably upon this excellent plan that the members of the city staff and the Housing Authority and others have put together, and that we are able to sustain the housing that is desperately needed in the community and give the individuals in this park the support that they need to maintain affordable housing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Wheatley. Any other members of the public who wish to speak to this item, please raise your hand in the app. And
Chair Friedman, there are no other hands raised at this time.
I will close public comment and now turn it over to my colleagues, Councilmember Gutierrez and Harmon. I see Councilmember Harmon, your hand is raised, and then so you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair Friedman. Apologies again about my video. Yes, I just want to echo the sentiments of Ms. Wheatley. This was a real success. I remember 6 or 8 months ago having a conversation with our state senator and feeling a bit at a loss, frankly, about solutions that could help this park, how we could move forward with the challenges, the financial challenges that they were facing. And this is yet another example. And I feel it's just such an honor that week after week, we find ourselves saying, wow, what creative financing solutions our housing professionals have developed. And this is certainly another instance of that, and one where we see many different levels of government and different agencies coming to the table in service of affordable housing in our community. So I just, I couldn't be prouder of the work that's been done and more grateful. I do want to just reiterate my long-term interest in us really working with community members to make sure that we don't find ourselves in this position down the road where folks feel trapped by financial decisions that have been made 10, 20, 30, or excuse me, or more years ago. So perhaps that's something for the future for us to to really look into to see, of course, as Ms. Doubles said, there is no one size fits all, and she's certainly right about that. But there may be some general guidance we can work on putting together for folks so that hopefully we don't get here again, but truly just this is a real success story and my gratitude for everyone continuing to be so engaged on how to serve our affordable housing needs. It's just, your work's been exemplary, not only on this, but on so many other items that have come before us in the last few months. And Mr. Chair, I would be very proud to, I guess the motion would be to move forward staff recommendations to the full council, but I'm happy to make the appropriate motion when the time comes. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Harmon. Councilmember Gutierrez.
Thank you, Chair Friedman. I wanted to make the motion as well, so I'll second it. But I want to thank the city attorney's office. I did attend the last community meeting of this case, and I wanted to thank Mr. Rob Frederick and his team because I was invited. The community members they were nervous. I mean, it's their homes, and there was a lot of miscommunication because of the language. So I really want to thank both the city staff and the Housing Authority for the great job that they did, but just being there in the Zoom call and witnessing how the way that the Housing Authority were communicating with the community was just awesome to hear. They were really trying to have them understand how serious this situation was and why they had to really push forward and make it a quick decision. It was awesome to see the community building, but also I'm just really, really happy that the city attorney's office, their commitment to make this happen was just incredible. And I really didn't have to do much. So I would like to second the motion if possible.
Great. So before we go to the motion, I would like to give Rob Fredericks a chance to speak before we vote on the motion. So Mr. Fredericks, if you could turn your mic on, I see your camera there. You have the floor, Mr. Fredericks.
Thank you, Chair Friedman and committee members. I have a lot of thanks to pass around for us to get to this point with this plan. First to our colleagues at the city, Ms. Doubles, Mr. Isaacson, City Attorney's Office, Sarah Connect, for all their work in helping us craft this plan that was acceptable to state HCD and also to Senator Lamone's office for helping us as well. You know, our mission is to create safe, affordable housing and opportunities for residents. And we're really fearful of this going to foreclosure and having an investor come in and buy the property. Once that state loan was paid off, there would be no affordability protections recorded against the property. With this new covenant, this new affordability covenant that's proposed, this 90 years, it runs with the land, regardless of whether the loans are paid off or not. So the affordability is protected. And that's what we want to see at the end of the day, is protection of the residents that live there now and the future residents, so that we have this great community assets. Finally, I just want to thank my colleague Skip Szymanski, who has led the charge on this, as well as so many other developments that have been successful and getting us to this stage. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Fredericks, and I think you covered all that need to be thanked. There's a lot of effort that went into this, as Councilmember Gutierrez, I think, intimated that there was a lot of effort went into this. So the motion's been made and seconded, and I would just like to add to what's been said is this is a big deal in that we're able to keep 41 of our most vulnerable low-income residents in their homes and extend the affordability covenants for 90 years. And it's a really big deal. And I want to thank all those who have been thanked by Mr. Fredericks, by Councilmember Gutierrez, Councilmember Harmon, and our staff. But in particular, I do want to thank Senator Monique Limon and her office for getting engaged on on this issue at the right time when it was brought to their attention, and really working with state HCD. I know that there was a lot of challenges, and to work through those and come to this solution, which is innovative. And so really her staff and the senator really helped push the ball with HCD. So I want to make sure that she's recognized for the work that her and her staff did as well to get us to this point. And then again, this 90-year affordability covenant extension at a time when we just learned through the census that we're actually losing some units more than we're actually building in cases of rental housing. And this is a little different, but when we're losing units at a faster pace than we're building them, in some cases, to be able to extend those for 90 years and keep these in there and keep our low-income residents in their homes, and that security is again a big deal. So just wanted to support it. And at this point, we do have a motion on the floor. If we could get a roll call, please, Mr. DeMartini.
Yes, the motion was made by Committee Member Harmon and seconded by Committee Member Gutierrez. We'll start with Committee Harmon.
Yes.
Committee Member Gutierrez.
Yes.
Committee Chair Friedman.
Yes.
The motion passes unanimously.
Thank you for that. And that's one of the items that I think makes us enjoy doing this job is to help our fellow residents. So now we are on to the large item for today, which is pension management strategy. And I will turn that over to Mr. DeMartini and for the PowerPoint.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Committee Chair Freeman, members of the Finance Committee. My name is Keith DeMartini. I'm the city's Finance Director. And I'd also like to introduce Mr. Dan Matusiewicz. He is a consultant with GovInvest, and he just came on screen just now. And he will be presenting many of the slides along with me today. The city has used the GovInvest platform over the past few years, which has allowed us to model various impacts to the city's pension costs. Dan has over 30 years of municipal finance, treasury, and accounting experience, and he was the former finance director for the city of Newport Beach, where they implemented a comprehensive pension management strategy, which we are going to be talking with you in great detail today, which inevitably saved that city millions and millions of dollars of ongoing long-term pension costs. So I'm really happy to have Dan here with me today to present many of these slides along with me. So we'll go on to the next slide, please. Next slide, please, where we'll cover the agenda for today. So this is really meant to be a study session. This is a long agenda item because this is a very, very important topic in regards to the city's fiscal sustainability. We pay a significant amount of money in pension costs, and we have a very large liability on the city's financial statements in regards to our pension costs in the long term as well. So the purpose of today is really to educate. It's to communicate the significance of the current and the projected pension costs on the city. It's to identify reasons for the current situation, talk about what action the city has already taken to control these costs and the liabilities, and then discuss potential actions that we can take both in the near and the long future to help minimize these costs going forward. Next slide, please. So here's sort of the long-term roadmap that we envision for managing our pension costs over time. And it really starts with today. Today is where we educate, we communicate, we talk about where we've been, what is impacting our pension costs today and going forward. And then we want to start analyzing, which we've already done some of that work, but it will require additional analysis to really understand what we really can do to achieve benefit and lower costs for our pension costs going forward, present those options to the Finance Committee and the City Council, and then ask for you to formally adopt potential changes to our policies or other tools to manage those costs. And then we move into administering those and then eventually evaluating. So this is a long-term strategy that we are hoping to implement at your guidance and support of the Finance Committee and the City Council. And we will proceed as such. Next slide, please. So next slide, please. Let's first start with providing just a really high-level overview of what it means to have a pension system and what those retirement benefits look like. And I'll turn this over to Dan in a few minutes here. We are a member of CalPERS, which stands for the California Public Employees Retirement System. It is a multi-employer pension and healthcare administrator for many municipalities throughout the state of California. And public employers select those benefit levels by contract. So we have a contractual obligation as a city to provide pension benefits to our retirees upon retirement. It is a promise benefit made by the contracting agency, the city. So it is our obligation to pay those, not necessarily CalPERS. Once that promise benefit is made, those benefits can only be changed prospectively going forward. And there's a really important example that occurred in 2013 with the enaction of the PEPRA legislation, the Public Employees Pension Reform Act, which we will talk about as well. Oftentimes when cities talk about pension systems and the overarching costs, the question inevitably comes up about, well, why couldn't we just leave CalPERS and start our own retirement system? And it is not practically an option. It is very much prohibitively expensive for a number of reasons. And so that is not an option really for the city at this time. Next slide, please. So how do we pay CalPERS? There are really two major ways in which the city and employees pay CalPERS so that they have enough financial resources to eventually pay out pension benefits over time. The first way is through what is called normal cost, which is a percent of payroll. So every time we run payroll, every 2 weeks, both the employee and the city contribute an amount of money on behalf of that employee to CalPERS every 2 weeks. That's the normal cost. Also, the other very large amount of money we pay CalPERS is through our unfunded actuarial liability amortization payment, which we will define and describe what that means and how that is paid in the future. But those two components make up the city and employees' total contribution for the city of Santa Barbara to CalPERS. Next slide, please. So as I said earlier, the normal cost plus the unfunded actuarial liability equals the minimum annual payment. The employee and the employer rates depend really on a number of factors. It depends on different pension plans that different types of employees are in. For example, public safety employees are in a different CalPERS plan compared to most other members as well. And that PEPRA legislation that was enacted back in 2013 has a number of different evaluation criteria. So there are different costs associated with PEPRA employees versus those that came prior to PEPRA, which are referred to as classic employees. Next slide, please. Now I'll turn it over to Dan, who's going to talk a little bit more detail about the CalPERS pension system.
Thank you, Keith. Mr. Chair and members of the committee, thanks for allowing me to address the council today. What you see before you is the famous pension buck that CalPERS has presented over the years. Unfortunately, well, you can, from the slide, you can see that 55 cents of each dollars are really provided by the investment earnings, but unfortunately that percentage of the pension buck has been dropping over the decades. And I can remember when it was as high as 70% in the high 60s. But as the investment markets have incurred some problems, then with the fixed benefit, unfortunately, as investment earnings fall, the onus falls to the employers and the members. And as you can see, currently, it's about 55% is provided from investment earnings. And that's one of the reasons why investment earnings, our pension plans are so sensitive to investment earnings. And right now, the employee and the employers are making it that difference, about 45%. In Santa Barbara employees, you have a mix of between employees paying as low as 6 3/4%, likely your PEPRA employees, and as high as 13%. Next slide, please. So this is a very important slide in that there are a number of both economic and demographic assumptions that drive the cost or affordability of the promised benefit. So keep in mind, the benefit level is fixed except for prospective changes. So we have a little bit of an algebraic conundrum. If the benefits are fixed and some of these actuarial assumptions or experience. And let me define, assumptions, it might equate to your budget, and experience essentially represents actual. So when the actual experience deviates from the assumption, additional unfunded liability occurs. And as we mentioned, the investment return, which is part of the economic assumptions, when that changes, it has an extraordinary impact on pension plans. But there are other items. If salary growth is larger than the assumed, what used to be 2.75% annual salary growth, if that difference, if the city gives a larger than a 2.75% increase across the entire payroll, then that would also create an unfunded liability. As would early retirements, and the level of benefits and inflation could drive the cost and affordability of the plan. Next slide, please. So in this illustration, I want to spend a little bit of time here to kind of define some of pensions are laden with jargon, and you might hear or read in the VAL that there's a present value projected benefit, and that's the ultimate savings goal upon somebody's retirement. And in this view, we're looking at the pension system through the eyes of a singular employee hired at age 25, worked for 30 years, and the savings goal at retirement would be that projected present value projected benefit. That's not the portion that that's not where your savings goal is measured. It's actually at a point of time for that individual employee. So if that's the ultimate savings goal, the accrued liability is what is the savings goal at that picture point in time. So at age 43 or 44, that blue line represents your accrued liability. The sum of the green bars, which represent investment earnings, and the employer contributions would represent the total market value of assets. And the difference between the market value of assets and your accrued liability is what amounts to your unfunded accrued liability. And it's important to note that neither the market value of the assets or the accrued liability do not show on your balance sheet. Essentially, the only thing that does is when you fall behind on your funding progress, the unfunded accrued liability is the portion that falls on the city's balance sheet. But in addition to investment earnings falling short, there are a number of other experience issues that could cause an unfunded liability. For example, if an employee lives longer than their expected expiration date, that is an example of mortality risk. And again, the employer and employees are responsible for that unfunded liability that may occur at that point. Next slide, please. So normal cost is equivalent. It's probably the closest thing to the service cost or the annual operating cost of the pension benefit, under the assumption that all actuarial assumptions are met. And if there isn't that difference between the assumed or budgeted expectation and actual experience, then an unfunded liability is created, and that would cause the payment on the UAL, and that amortization of the UAL is sort of the self-correcting component of the equation. So when there are differences between the normal cost assumption and experience, that the amortization of that unfunded accrued liability is amortized over a 20-year period, and it's designed to get the plan back into get the plan to back on track as far as the funding progress. Next slide, please. So that actuarial accrued liability, as we discussed, could arise either by changing the assumptions, it could be benefit enhancements, but typically the change in either the actual experience of investments or the assumed rate of return, which is often referred to as that discount rate. So the discount rate is simply that assumed investment return. And as we noted on the slide with the projected value, present value projected benefit, the discount rate is essentially, or getting back to the accrued liability, simply means taking that assumed present value projected benefit and stripping out the future investment earnings, getting back to your accrued liability. So if there are any changes in benefits, changes in assumption or experience that UAL is created, and again, it is intended to get the agency back on track in terms of funding their promised benefit. Next slide, please. So what does a formula mean? The you hear terms like 2.7% at 55. 2.7 is really that benefit factor if the employee retires at age 55. That benefit factor is applied as a percentage of their pensionable payroll. So in the example where we use 30 years of service and the benefit factor is 2.7, 30 times 2.7 is 75%. That final compensation could be either the final 12 months or final or highest 36 months. And that percentage would be applied towards their highest compensation in either the highest 12 or highest 36 months. And they would receive a lifetime annuity of, in this case, of approximately $81,000. And it's important to note that employees can retire as early as age 50 and start drawing a benefit, but then you see the benefit factor is reduced. At age 54, it'd be 2.56%. At age 53, 2.42%. At age 53, 2.28, and so on. So it's reduced the earlier they retire. Next slide, please.
I'm just gonna do it strategically for questions from my colleagues before we go to the next section. So if either one of my colleagues have any questions just on the pension formulas themselves at this point before we go into what the problems are and then the cities, if council committee member Gutierrez or committee member Harmon have any questions at this point just on what's been presented so far, please just feel free to speak up right now. And if not, then we'll continue the presentation. Okay, not hearing any, we'll continue on. Thank you.
Okay, so let's get into really there's good news and bad news, but let's describe the problem. So next slide, please. So most cities are finding themselves in this this position with those enhanced benefits that we'll talk about later that were enacted in 2000 or in late 90s, early 2000, are expensive benefits. And so when you add up the city's accrued liability, which is the amount of funds that the city should have on hand, you know, at 6/30/21, it was probably about $1.2 billion, and it continues to grow at a rate close to 7% a year. And so if you think about those amount of assets that are invested aggressively in the equities market, the swing on $1.2 billion, CalPERS currently has a a volatility factor associated with their portfolio of plus or minus 12%. So 68% of the time, the investment earnings should be plus or should be, now 6.8%, but plus or minus 12% in any one year. And if the city were fully funded at $1.2 million, that swing could be, close to $100 million in any one year. So if you think about that level of change relative to the city's actual revenue base, one, we know that it's growing faster than the revenue base. So the city will continue to become fairly highly leveraged against, when you think about revenues relative to the amount of accrued liability or the market value of assets, pensions can represent a large impact on the city's ability to provide operating costs. And what we've heard over the decade is that pension costs, because some of these dynamics, pension costs are squeezing out some valuable program costs. But as we discussed, that the pension benefits are fixed. So this is something, because of both the size and the amount of volatility, that should be reviewed early and often, and receive appropriate attention each year to make sure that this large liability doesn't get out of hand, and the city takes step early so that they can have time to ramp up to address these swings that can happen in the market. Next slide, please. Next slide.
So Dan, I think I'll take it over from here. Thank you so much for giving us that sort of background with CalPERS and kind of where we are today. And now what we'll transition to at this section of the study sessions, talk about how this really truly impacts the city of Santa Barbara. And we'll also talk a little bit more about actions that CalPERS has taken over the years and how that has directly impacted us as well. So let me first start with just our general fund multi-year forecast, which is a graph that we typically show starting around this time of year, getting ready for our budget process. And what this shows is the gray columns show our fund balance in the general fund, typically really considered our reserves. The red line shows our expenditures, and the green dotted line shows our revenues. And so anytime where you see the red line above our green line, that means we have a structural operating deficit every year. And this is a preliminary forecast for the upcoming 4 fiscal years as we get ready to issue our budget instructions to departments actually tomorrow, so that we can forecast out and plan for what our known expenditures are over that time period and what is a reasonable assumption for our revenues. We have a structural deficit every year in the multi-year forecast. And one of the major drivers for that on the expenditure side is our required fixed pension costs, both our normal costs that we pay every pay period, as well as increases annually for our unfunded actuarial liability that both Dan and I have been speaking to you about. Those are known expenses that we must pay. And so that does limit our ability to direct those funds to other services or functions of the city. Next slide, please. This slide here shows what the burden is of our pension costs by major fund. So the blue line shows our general fund. The orange line is all of our enterprise funds, such as water, wastewater, solid waste, those operations, the airport, the waterfront. And then the gray line is pretty much everything else. As you can see here, that all of these are increasing, but the responsibility on the general fund for ongoing growth in pension costs is more substantial. And the general fund pays a majority of the city's pension costs. That's because the general fund pays for most of those types of services: police, fire, library, parks and recreation, public works, so on and so forth. Next slide, please. This slide here is sort of a snapshot of both the projected costs for the normal cost for our pension, as well as the unfunded actuarial liability. So the dark gray bars on the bottom of the graph on the left represent the projected normal costs over the next 30 years. And that stays relatively flat. And Dan will talk about this in a little more detail. And a lot of that has to do with the transition from the impacts of the PEPRA legislation really taking effect in the long term. There are reduced benefits and for PEPRA employees, as well as additional costs that PEPRA employees pay for their pension benefits over time. The classic members are typically more expensive. So as those classic members retire and more PEPRA members become the primary workforce, proportionately, those costs sort of normalize out. Where we see substantial costs is in our unfunded actuarial liability. And as you can see, those costs are projected to go up over the next 3 or 4 years, kind of rebaseline a little bit, but continue to go up over the next 10 years. So this is a substantial burden on the city's annual operating budget that we must account for. The graph on the right shows what percentage of total, what is our payment to PERS as a percent of total salaries. And as you can see, for public safety, in particular, police and fire, we pay a substantial amount as a percentage of total salary for those employees' pension costs. So it is a significant amount of money, and it will be continuing into the foreseeable future. Next slide, please. So I'll turn it back over to Dan, who's going to talk a little bit about some of the nuances with Santa Barbara and then things that CalPERS has done in recent years.
Sure. So this slide also illustrates the again the sensitivity that the plan has towards investment earnings, and so we would typically, not only run the current assumption, which is close to that 7%. You can see that 7% is being repaid over a period of time, and if they earn close to 7%, you would have your liability paid off around 2043, 2044, and that's that self-correcting mechanism with the UAL. However, if earnings fall short of that expectation, you can see the red line at 6%. You could see that the UAL starts moving away from the city, and that is something the city really needs to keep a close eye on to make sure that doesn't balloon out and become the city becomes overly leveraged against that unfunded liability. So I try to think about it as keeping that liability close to you and not letting it get too far away from you. And you can see that has not, the liability is amortized over 20 years for each loss that comes through as a individual, discrete, separate liability. Each time there is a difference between actual experience and the assumption. And so over time, you can see if the city incurred pervasive 6% returns, that unfunded liability, the cost would, it's not a straight line. You're paying off some bases that perhaps were incurred back in 2008, but then you see the line starting to tail away as the 6% lower earnings if that were to occur, then your payment on your UAL would continue to move away, and that's where all of volatility is, as we'll see on the next coming slide, and in fact the previous slide that Keith presented on. So let's just use the next slide as an example, and then we'll move through. So as Keith indicated, the normal cost, which is represented, now this happens to be the miscellaneous plan, but it's true for all, is that normal cost is pretty stable. And what you would normally expect is through a scenario looking at 2037, 38. The normal cost, the lower part of the bars, on a nominal dollar basis, you would expect that normal cost to grow at the same rate as payroll, which is assumed to be 2.75% each year. But you see that it's flat in the interim, in fact, sloping downward, and that again has, as Keith described, is the transition from classic benefits down to PEPRA benefits. So it also is a good indicator of when most of your classics are soon to be out of the system. So you can see by 2036, 37, there's that inflection point where your normal costs start increasing roughly at the rate of payroll. And so I would venture a guess that's when most of your classic employees are out of the system, at least for the miscellaneous plan. So moving on to slide 23, I won't spend much more time about, but this is how your police plan looks. And again, you can see all of the volatility is in the UAL payment. Next slide, please. Fire, same thing. The normal cost is very uniform, and your UAL payment is, again, represents the volatility. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about, we mentioned I mentioned earlier, in 99 and 2000, there were enhanced benefits offered through SB 400 and AB 616. And for those of you that may not know a little bit of the history, you can see the fund was close to 130% funded back then. And the world was really looking through rose-colored glasses back then. You had the housing market that was in a boom. We had .com valuations that were very high relative to their actual earnings, if they had any earnings at all. And so there was a tremendous wealth effect that was pervasive through, I think, not only local government, but the broader community. And unfortunately, the good times didn't go on forever. And that 130% funded ratio gave cities the ability to say, well, gosh, we can enhance benefits at virtually no cost. So labor groups were fairly effective making that case. And then cities were put in a very difficult position when another city adopted a higher benefit plan. Then labor groups, as well as the cities, were concerned, well, in order to be able to continue to attract and retain employees, we need to follow suit. So Santa Barbara is not alone in this. Almost every city in California or local agency adopted these higher benefits. But again, it was at a time when the world looked very different than it did today. And unfortunately, the good times didn't last forever. And you can see, when I started my career, the discount rate was as high as 8.75%. Again, that's the assumed earnings rate. And you can see that it was reduced from 8.25 to 7.75, and then down to where we are at 6.8, which we will talk about in future slides. The next slide, please. So, after the Great Recession, we started there. Can't blame it all on the recession. I think CalPERS had a number of policies for amortizing the liabilities, just assuming that the investment markets would return to normal high levels and would essentially be able to invest their way out. Unfortunately, there are a number of factors why that didn't occur. But the amortization policies were so lenient that very little principal was being paid off. those former policies were really meant as a stopgap just to allow the investment markets to return to expected higher levels. Well, as we know, they didn't. And so CalPERS had to unwind some of those former amortization policies that allowed some of these liabilities to grow. They've since fixed that with a shorter amortization, level dollar payment. So I wouldn't expect liabilities to get as far out of control as they did after the 2008 crisis, but they are continuing to lower the assumed rate of earnings for reasons we'll discuss. But that gave way in 2012. Then Governor Brown enacted the Public Employers Pension Reform Act of 2012. So any employees hired after January 1, 2013 do receive a lower benefit, and they are much more manageable. But if you think about an employee's lifespan, both their work history, working for 30 years plus 30 years in retirement, this really takes almost 60 years for prospective benefits to really work their way out of the system. So it is not a one and done problem. It is a problem that needs to be reviewed, as I mentioned, frequently and with appropriate attention. Next slide, please.
So I think I take over on this one. Thank you, Dan, for going through that. I appreciate that. And this is meant to be just sort of a dashboard of the impact of our pension costs and liabilities to the city as a whole. I won't go through it in much detail. Again, much of the information on this presentation today is meant to be a study session and informative and can be referenced. The main takeaway on this slide is that none of our pension plans for police, fire, miscellaneous, and others are fully funded. They hover between 60 to 70% of a funding status, which is not atypical, right? Many cities, many counties, many members of the CalPERS organization find themselves where their member groups have a very similar funded status between the 60s and the 70s range. Some are better, and those agencies that have a greater funding status have taken action in and have implemented various pension management strategies over time, which we'll be talking about in just a few moments. We carry a substantial net pension liability on our financial statements. It'll be over $350 million in the ACFR, the annual comprehensive financial reports that we will be presenting to you next week at this time. So it is a substantial liability on our financial statements that we think it's important for the Finance Committee to be aware of. Next slide, please. This slide just makes it very clear and specifies the cost of us to pay our unfunded actuarial liability. You can see here in fiscal year 22, the current year that we're in, we pay just above $32 million to CalPERS for our annual contribution for that liability. And again, you see that it will be scheduled to grow. It's increasing to just below $38 million in the next couple of years. And then it will continue to be a substantial burden for us to make sure that we budget for and pay for. Next slide, please. Turn it back over to Dan.
Thank you, Keith. This is representative of CalPERS investment earnings, and what you should, there's a couple takeaways. The red line represents the assumed discount rate, and you can see that as trended down over time. But they've had some very good years where they earned well above the expected rate of return, and there are patterns in here that you could say are normal business cycle. They're cyclical in nature. They don't earn linear returns. They achieve the expected rate of return by years where they earn a high return. And then there's always a reversion to the mean or a reversion to more normal expected returns. And then there are secular events, these one-off events like the dot-com crash, as well as the Great Recession, that were more or less traumatic events that shocks to the system. But you could see the dashed line, which is just represents a linear trend line of that over time, the investments have been coming down. And the chief actuary pointed out that, you know, where we see this linear trend line, their 20-year return was only 6.9%, that in effect, CalPERS has been undercharging the agencies during that period of time on a normal cost basis, which means, and that that is part, and actually a large part why there's such a large unfunded liability today, is that, again, they were counting on great returns. Now you notice where the arrow is, we had a very good one-year return, but for every cluster of good years, remember there's that reversion to the mean. And so that if not next year or the year after, we would expect returns to come down to more normal times. And while certainly the 21.3% return is welcome, just keep in mind that that is, in essence, almost borrowing from future year returns, because we know GDP growth isn't growing at 21%. So, we had this exuberance coming out of, or what we thought was coming out of the pandemic. But make no mistake, can't count on that 21% return, that there will be years where we would expect that to normalize and perhaps even be lackluster returns, fall below their expected rate of return. Next slide, please. So I did mention that 21% return was welcome. And in, if you don't know the history of the risk mitigation policy, that was enacted in 2015 by then Chief Actuary Alan Milligan, whose desire, hearing from public employers and elected officials, is that the CalPERS investment returns are volatile. We'd like to see less volatility. So his thought was, okay, let's take some of the risk out of the current portfolio. And so he set up a matrix that for every trigger point, every if the assumed return was 7%, he had various thresholds so that if they beat the return by 5, 8, 10, or in this case 14.3%, because they expected to earn 7.8, they actually earned 21.3. So that is an experience gain of 14.3%. That triggered on that matrix a 20 basis points or 0.2 of a reduction to the expected rate of return from 7% down to 6.8%. And that is where they chose not to reduce the discount rate any further. And there was a lot of conjecture early in the year that might have been the case. But what they did find is that the current policy, the current investment portfolio would only generate a return close to 6.25%. So they pushed back to staff saying, okay, we acknowledge we need to take on more risk in order to keep costs somewhat manageable for the pension for local agencies. So next slide, please. So what you see here, so this is a combination of both your, so let's take, it shows the twofold impact, not only the 21% return, but the lowering of the discount rate. And if you follow the orange or gold bars, you can see a small hash mark that is showing that there's going to be an increase starting in fiscal year 23-24 to your normal cost, and that will go on forever. until they change the discount rate. And that, I believe, is about $1 million a year of an increase to your service cost or your operating costs. But that 21% return also will have an impact on your UAL payment. And these hash marks are where your payments would have otherwise been. And those were what you've seen in Keith's previous slides on the UAL. But assuming they earn at least 6.8%, your UAL payment, so while your normal cost may be coming down by your normal cost may increase $1 million, your UAL payments will start to decrease, by either 3 million. They'll phase that in, and depending on how far you look, your UAL payment could reduce as low as at the lowest point around a $10 million swing in your UAL payment. But remember, that's if and only if all future assumptions are achieved, and that includes earning at least 6.8%. And we looked at that sensitivity analysis. If they earn something less than that, your UAL payments could look very different. So while this is a good picture, I would say proceed with caution, because we know that for every cluster of good years, there will be some bad years to follow and changes picture significantly. Next slide, please.
Dan, if I may jump in for just a second, go back to that slide. What's another main takeaway on that slide, if you could go back, Ms. Nicholson, is that when and if CalPERS has a lower rate of return that they achieve, the bars will go back up, right? Every year, the UAL actuarial assumptions we get are adjusted, and those bars could go back up to where it shows that it's more expensive for us to pay. And the number of years that we have to pay will go out as well. So it's a 30-year snapshot in time. So every year, it's possible that our plan to pay our UAL will just get extended a year. So this is not going away within this time period. It's meant to be a picture at a point in time that's meant to be managed. And for the sake of time, Dan, I might just skip a few slides here so that we can get to what the city has done so far and what actions we're recommending to take. So if I can ask Jen, if you could skip to slide 34, I'd appreciate that. So now what I'd like to do is talk about what has the city done. We have taken action. The city has taken decisive action over the years to attempt to minimize our pension costs and the liability. And so I want to make sure that you are aware of what the city has already done. And then let's shift to talking about what actions we can take going forward, and then open it up for discussion. So next slide, please. So first, before going into that, this slide sort of shows the negotiated benefit levels for the city of Santa Barbara, which we've talked about already for the different plans, the miscellaneous plans, police and fire, and the other ones. And also just a brief comparison against the city of Oxnard and the city of Ventura, two close cities to us in proximity, similar sizes, a lot of similarities and a lot of differences. But what it shows is that the pension plans, for the most part, are relatively the same. And another takeaway on here is that these cities are also struggling with their sort of net position, some greater than others, on the amount of liabilities they have on their books for their pension costs. And also another takeaway is that over time, with the enactment of the PEPRA legislation, that will ease some of the burden. As you can see, the age for retirement benefits, as well as a percent contribution, will have a factor with PEPRA going forward. Next slide, please. The primary way that the city has addressed pension costs is really over the past 5 years or so, where we have taken advantage of paying an annual lump sum payment to CalPERS for our unfunded actuarial liability. So we have options on how we choose to pay that. We can pay it monthly or over the course of the fiscal year, which will be more expensive, or we can pay it all upfront in July. And we have chosen to take advantage of that option over the past number of years. And what we have effectively done by doing that, by managing our cash flow and ensuring that we have adequate cash in July to pay those payments, is we have saved the city approximately $3.3 million over the past 5 years, just by that simple action of paying all up front versus paying throughout the year. So the city will plan to continue to do that. We have budgeted for doing that. We will continue to do that. So that is one thing that we have done. Next slide, please. The other strategy that has been implemented over the years with a number of the bargaining groups is implemented cost sharing. And what cost sharing means is that through labor negotiations, the labor groups agree to pick up a portion of the employer's pension costs. So in other words, the employee group would agree to, through negotiations, pay some of the city's responsibility of that employee's pension costs. This has been a common strategy that has been implemented by many cities over the years. It ranges anywhere between 1.5% to 4% typically. It's important to note, though, that the negotiation is a give and take. So there will be something else agreed to as part of a cost sharing agreement typically, and that would typically come from increasing an employee's salary, a COLA increase, which obviously has longer term pension implications as well. It's also important to note that some of the cost sharing agreements that have been negotiated and implemented over the years have recently been removed during recent negotiations, which brings us to the next slide, please, which shows that sort of over time, the employee rate and how much of the employer share they're actually picking up. On that graph on the far right, it shows that over the past year that is declining. So the employees are no longer picking up really hardly any portion of the employer share. And that was agreed to through negotiations. But it's just important to note that that strategy had been implemented over the years, but the benefit to the city for sort of the employee picking up a portion of the share has largely gone away in recent years. So just want to make sure that the Finance Committee is aware of that. Next slide, please. I'll turn it over to Dan to give a brief overview of how we should be embarking on a pension management strategy, sort of from his perspective and from staff's perspective. And then we'll talk about really specific strategies that we can implement as a city. Dan, please.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So I think we can all agree that what we just went through, there are no really appropriate analogs to look back in history. There are so many, I like to say there's an overabundance of uncertainty between additional pandemic waves, geopolitical risk, political gridlock. There's a problem we didn't only scratch the surface on the investment side, that fixed income yields when fixed income and the 10-year yield got as low as 55 basis points and is only maybe 1.5%. It's hard to imagine a scenario where CalPERS can earn 7% when fixed income is 1.5%. So it's not just CalPERS, but the entire rest of the community is realizing the fixed income portion of the portfolio, which typically would represent 40%. They have to look to either alternative assets, real estate, private loans, et cetera. So earning the investment environment is difficult, I would say, as well as a lot of uncertainty. There's been a tremendous run up in the market, so I'd say that there is more downside risk of market correction than there is upside. And then there's, of course, those unknowns that are out there. Who could have predicted the pandemic? But we know that there are new threats around the corner that we haven't even contemplated. Next slide, please. And so I've done some work with the Government Finance Officers Association in the past, and their approach to these uncertainties is to really accept that uncertainty is inevitable, to assess what risks that you can identify, and that might be fire, earthquake, as well as volatility in revenues. And so you look back for as many analogs that you can, but we mentioned this aspect of that there are uncertainties that are difficult to predict, and they find that agencies typically underestimate those risks. So their strong recommendation is to augment your reserves while times are good. And that might be replenishing reserves that you have today, or if you're looking at just mitigating your risk to PERS, setting money aside specifically for that when we know the investment market will have some lackluster years in the future. Next slide, please. So,
Dan, if you don't mind, I'll take this one. Thank you for that. So just, sure. I wanted staff to offer up a proposed mission statement and some key objectives for the Finance Committee's consideration for how we might go about implementing a pension management strategy. And this mission statement reads: to control and reduce costs of employee pensions while maintaining fair compensation and vital city services. So just an overarching statement about how we might go about addressing our pension costs over the future. And there are some really key objectives that staff recommends sort of acknowledging and working through when considering different strategies. And at the very, very beginning, at the very start of it, we're recommending to look at our reserve policies. Many cities over the years have implemented different mechanisms, such as a pension stabilization reserve, to assist with to sort of minimizing the impact over time of pension costs. And that is sort of the cornerstone of what we might do first. And then there are other objectives, such as increasing our funding ratio, opening and administering a trust, and reducing those costs over time, which Dan will talk about two really specific mechanisms as well. Next slide, please. Before we do, I wanted to focus some time on reserves and funding policies specifically. And really, this would be the recommendation to focus on first before implementing anything further. The reserves really are our cornerstone for our financial flexibility and just our sustainability. We have volatile revenue sources, being a primarily tourist-based economy with our sales tax and our transient occupancy tax and others. And we've seen that. We have had impacts on our reserves over the years, particularly related to COVID, where we had dipped into them substantially and have implemented strong fiscal policies to make our way through that, but that will likely continue. And so if we can amend or adjust our reserve policies to focus specifically on our pension obligations, that will look very favorably on bond rating agencies. We continue to have a very strong credit rating, which is fantastic, and that will be good for future debt issuances, which we'll be planning to do in the very near future with the police facility, for example. It demonstrates to the community that we have strong financial management practices. We'll use that as guidance in deliberating and adopting our annual budget process. So there's long-term sustainability impacts from really focusing on reserves at the onset. I'll turn it back over to Dan, who's going to talk just very briefly about the benefits and challenges of setting up a Section 115 trust and issuing a pension obligation bond. Dan, if we could just spend a few minutes so that we can leave adequate time for the committee's direction and next steps, please. Next slide.
Sure. So the city has some options if you're not ready to make a full commitment in sending money to CalPERS, if you keep it in-house. We know most agencies invest in a kind of 1 to 3 year strategy, which may be equivalent to, let's say, a 2-year treasury. 2-year treasury only earns today about 40 to 50 basis points, so it's not all that great. So Section 115 trust allows you to set money aside, including equities, to set aside and with a potential higher earnings rate, depending on your appetite for risk. There are strategies from very conservative that might earn 4% to very aggressive strategies that could get close to 6 or 7%. But it is a vehicle. If one of your acknowledgements is that CalPERS represents one of the threats, and one of the reasons you want to have a reserve. Section 115 plan is one way to achieve some higher returns than otherwise keeping the funds in-house. Next slide, please. So you could, obviously use it as a rate stabilization fund. The fund, it could, unlike sending to CalPERS, the money goes one direction to CalPERS and it stays there. You can put the money in trust, and if need be, you could reimburse the city for even normal costs. So putting money in a 115 plan, you can earn a little higher rate of return and yet still have access to those funds, should the city need it in the future. And it does allow you that broader universe of investments that the government code otherwise restricts you to earn on your normal portfolio. Next slide, please. So the limitations is, okay, so it's setting up another outside account. There may be, some minor costs to administer the trust. It doesn't directly impact your net pension liability, but you can always point to that in your footnotes to say, yes, but we have these funds set aside that are specifically in trust to handle this. There is some headline risk because you're investing in stocks and bonds that have volatility. And so there is investment risks associated with 115 plans. And, I think we have to remember whatever you set aside in trust might pale in comparison to what you already have in CalPERS. So, are you really, diversifying away from CalPERS? Probably not one of the reasons you would do that, but you do have to decide with some prioritization of where savings go, whether this concept of intergenerational equity, whether you're trying to accomplish projects today versus setting money aside for the future. Next slide, please. So pension obligation bonds have been very popular these days. You can still obtain extraordinarily low interest rates. And, paying down some of the debt is equivalent to essentially reducing some of your higher interest debt. But it is complex and it does carry some risk. It does, market timing is important. Incurring a loss early on can reduce your potential savings from a bond, from pension obligation bond. No voter approval is required, but it does really take a thoughtful, eyes wide open approach should the city pursue pension obligation bonds. Next slide, please. So you could see there have been a number of pension obligation bonds that have been issued. And as of late, you can see we're in 20, there were, the numbers were off the charts. And it's because there's that large spread between what you could borrow from and what CalPERS actually earns. And it's important to understand that the measurement of a successful one is not the difference between the assumed interest rate or the assumed earnings rate, but the difference between your borrowing rate and what CalPERS actually earns. And you won't really know what that is at the onset. So, a POB success can only be really guesstimated over time. But because of that spread between the low borrowing rate, a lot of agencies felt that it was a viable option because of that spread between the borrowing rate and what CalPERS potentially could earn over a long-term basis. Next slide, please. So, what it would do is you would swap that operating liability that has some volatility. That's that blue shaded area of what your current UAL payment looks like versus a fixed dollar payment. So you'd have not only achieve savings, but you would have some predictability in terms of the payment on the bonds. But that's not to say that UAL could not come back and be an additional layer on top of your fixed bond payment. Next slide, please. So the POB benefits allow you to restructure the plan, but and achieve near-term savings. You have an opportunity to borrow at historically low interest rates. That's one part of the equation. Now, the next question is what CalPERS can reasonably assume over that period. But because of that spread that we talked about, people feel it may be worth the risk. And should the city go down that, I would highly advise bringing on a municipal advisor to talk about the risks associated with issuing municipal securities. But it would improve your funded ratio, and rating agencies, view higher funding ratios as favorable. And it may eliminate some of the use for city reserves and to the necessity to reduce public services that squeeze of pension costs squeezing out important public services. Next slide, please. So the POB limitations, there is interest rate risk, and timing is important. As I mentioned, incurring a loss early on can greatly reduce the possibility of it having the savings that are estimated, it doesn't really mitigate any future risk. In fact, it essentially amplifies the upside and the downside. So if CalPERS does well, borrowing is a good thing and will amplify the upside potential. If CalPERS has bad returns, it also amplifies your losses on the downside. So considering while interest rates are still very low, we have to consider where the market is. There's been a big run up, and part of it is looking forward and trying to make your best guess of what CalPERS can reasonably assume over the term of the bonds. And again, it requires some discipline. You want to do this. A lot of agencies, when are doing it when they're in duress, but obviously you get a better credit rating when the city is in good financial condition, and so you can command a lower interest rate, further increasing the odds of a successful POB. Next slide.
Thank you, Dan. So I'll just wrap up here and turn it over to the council, to the committee members. So sort of structuring where we could go from here, staff is sort of recommending that the Finance Committee consider implementing pension management strategies within this framework. First and foremost, staff is recommending continuing with our current strategies. So paying our annual UAL payment up front, considering cost sharing opportunities through normal course of labor negotiations, and then other strategies as well. Before implementing a Section 115 trust or considering issuing a POB, it's probably advisable to revise our existing reserve policies to consider implementing some structure of a pension stabilization reserve. And that could take different forms, where you take one-time revenues or annual surpluses that we might experience and allocating those directly to pension stabilization so that we can use those excess funds to pay down our long-term liabilities over time. And then, of course, setting up a Section 115 trust or issuing a POB would require additional analysis and further consideration, which we would be happy to bring back to you. Next slide, please. It's timely, actually, and noteworthy that the Santa Barbara County Grand Jury issued a report last week on the status of pension systems for cities within the county, all of whom are members of CalPERS. And they are considering the city of Santa Barbara's system as higher potential pension plan solvency risk. It's for all the factors that we talked about today. And their recommendations in that report are the same exact ones that we have discussed in detail today: issuing a POB, considering a Section 115 trust, creating a pension reserve fund. We'll be bringing this item to council in the coming months, and the report is directing the council to issue a plan by the end of the fiscal year. So this is really the start of us doing the hard work to develop a plan and putting something into action. Next slide, please. So we've done quite a lot of talking, a lot of education, a lot of communication about where we are today through our pension system and our costs. We're prepared to conduct additional analyses and then present options for the Finance Committee and the City Council in the upcoming number of months. And with that, I'd be happy to turn it back over to the committee to help answer any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. DiMartini, and for the presentation. And so first, before we go into hearing from my colleagues, I am going to, because we are running short on time, I am going to open it up for public comment. At this time, since we're not voting on anything, it is a discussion, we can open up for public comment. So are there any members of the public who wish to speak to this item? Please raise your hand in the app at this time. I am not seeing anyone, so I will close public comment. And if you could pull up slide 52, Mr. DiMartini, I think that will help the discussion today. I think it's slide 52, yes. So these are the four options. So I'll just kind of frame it. We're not taking a vote today. We're giving direction for different options to consider. And these are the four options that Mr. DiMartini is presenting with us and just wants to get our feedback. So we'll talk about it, and then he should have the direction that he needs to go forward. So with that, I do see Councilmember Harmon, and then Councilmember Gutierrez, if you'd like to speak after that, and I'll close it out. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Friedman, and thank you to staff and presenters for this. It's incredibly complicated and really fascinating. And you know, I have to admit, I'm going to need a little more time with this, I think, which is probably unsurprising to you experts. It's just not. I'm trying to wrap my head around it, but I really do appreciate the way you tried to lay it out for us, and clearly there's a lot to think about. So I wanted to just, I guess, begin very briefly, sort of with the caveat that I personally am very interested in our pension management policy, and also acutely aware of how much I don't know about pensions in general and the policy considerations. So, you know, I will make a couple of very initial, my initial thoughts here today, but I appreciate that this is going to be an ongoing conversation, because very clearly, if I've learned anything from this presentation, that I have got to sit down and do some serious research on my own end to really understand what it is that we're already in the thick of, and what I will be giving to future generations with the decisions that I advocate for here. And you know, that sort of brings up another point. I think generationally, for me, I really struggle often with conversations about unfunded pension liabilities. You know, it feels so much to me like a problem not of my own making, and that I sometimes just want to run screaming in the other direction. But I do see this as an opportunity truly for us to set up future generations much better than we have been, and to really try to resolve some of these big questions that I think are weighing on all of us as we sort of look to the future of work and how our lives will go in the next 20, 30, 40 years. So with all that said, I guess that's a major caveat, for I have no idea what I'm talking about here, but really appreciate the work you did to try to educate me. I would say first and foremost, certainly I really support continuing with the current strategies, and the prepayment in particular was, I was happy to learn about that. So thank you for making the effort to prioritize that. That seems like very good budgeting, excellent management. And I love it when we can save 3.3 or 3.5, whatever you said, $1 million just by smart budgeting. So I really appreciate that. Certainly want to continue. And then, cost sharing, yes. And I appreciated our mission statement as well. I wanted to highlight in my notes that I wrote down that I value that we are really trying to make sure that our employees are valued and respected, and that the unfunded liabilities are not sort of dealt with on the backs of our employees alone, and that we're trying to have a really respectful policy. So I appreciated that mission statement and support it very much. And then, I guess the only other thing I would add is just my first instinct. And again, I really do want to research this more, and I will. I'm more inclined toward the Section 115 trust option than the bond issuance. And, I just think, to me, that it just seemed to have less downsides. So that's kind of where I'm at right now. But again, I will follow the lead of our experts here myself, and I just wanted to put it out there that that's my initial thought. And finally, to ask if you could please resend this presentation to me, because I will be using it to guide my research as we move forward. And just my thanks. There's a lot of work to do, and I appreciated that timeline of the educate and then present. And clearly, for me, a lot of education is happening, and my thanks. And I think it's going to be an interesting couple of months as we develop this policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Harmon. And yes, Mr. DiMartini will be, I'm sure you can email that presentation to all three of us on here. It's a very in-depth presentation. Councilmember Gutierrez. You are available. I'll go ahead and start. Looks like we're having some technical issues there. So where I'm gonna say is first is I agree with where Councilmember Harmon came from on this. And for transparency, I met with Mr. DiMartini at length prior to this presentation to go over much of it and to understand these issues. So I would encourage my colleagues, before you go on doing your own research on these, is actually take some time to meet with Mr. DiMartini to walk you through it. And you have the ability to use him as a resource to really walk through these. These are complex issues, and they're not going to be solved overnight. And there's a number of different strategies with positive and negatives. So really, to be brief, I'm supportive of the first three on here. They make sense. And in regards to the bonding, I'm supportive of getting more information, but I have a lot of questions and concerns about it, as I expressed when you and I talked, Mr. DiMartini. And I'll say to myself, and I think to probably many others, it seems like that is issuing debt to pay debt. But there are some trade-offs to that. And when you use the analogy of when you're refinancing a mortgage, that made sense to me of what that's like. But again, we're running short on time because council's coming up. So I'm supportive of getting more information on all of these and continuing to have that discussion at finance throughout the early part of next year on all of these. And that's where I'm at right now. And thank you for all the work that you and our staff have done on this, especially with the current strategies to minimize the debt and save that $3.3 million. And I saw Councilmember Gutierrez, you are available and you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair Friedman. I want to thank city staff for all of this wonderful information, and that we're finally thinking about a long-term plan. I do want more information, and I'll definitely be asking city staff for more information. I do agree with Chair Friedman about the first three, but I have a couple questions, and I don't want to hold up the meeting, but I really appreciate city staff guiding us to a better path in the pension. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Councilmember Gutierrez. So I think at this point, since we're not voting on anything, Mr. DiMartini, do you have the direction that you need going forward to look at these different options, and then we'll work on a schedule of bringing those back to finance, maybe one at a time or all together. However, we'll figure that out as part of the early part of next year, going into like February, March, April timeline. Do you have everything you need at this point?
Yes, Chair Friedman and committee members, I do. I hear you loud and clear. We've received your direction. So staff will get to work and we'll start working on providing additional information about these various options. Again, I'm more than available to sit down and talk with each of you about this as well. And we will be scheduling additional items for future Finance Committee meetings in the near future. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you all. And with that, there are no further items on today's agenda. So this meeting of the Finance Committee is adjourned. Thank you very much.